I figured the answer to the question in the title would be clear-cut and easy to come by. An initial inquiry had shown multiple scholars mention the use of alcoholic concoctions and psychedelic mushrooms as doping agents for ancient Hellenic athletes, and I was curious as to what kind of benefits they experienced. The reason that I went into this study neutral with regard to any ethical considerations on whether or not these practices existed in ancient Greece is because there didn't appear to be such concept as doping to them. If they could gain an advantage through nutrition, then that was an application of superior knowledge. Hence, it wasn't considered cheating either by the athletes or by the institutions of the games. But when we begin examining how they viewed the potential harm caused by foods that could provide a boost in physicality, things begin to differ. There are accounts of doctors in antiquity arguing against consuming certain food that may give an advantage in performance, but would ultimately harm the athlete in the long run. Also, because psychedelics were taken quite seriously and used mainly in religious ceremonies like the Eleusinian Mysteries, it did seem odd to me that athletes would acquire and use them for sport. Hence, I had my doubts. And as the research progressed, I realized that the focus quickly shifted from doping to academic dishonesty. In reading through the modern literature, strictly academic articles and books, and investigating the sources they reference, I ended up uncovering a much larger yet very common issue with academia as it pertains to history, one that also plagues Pankration. The issue is twofold. Number one, making things up, and using the authority of a degree or of a university position to substantiate the claim because there is otherwise no evidence. And number two, citing other scholars without investigating their references. Focusing mostly on primary sources, which is ancient text or archaeological findings, is how I ended up with a vastly different understanding of Pankration and other ancient Hellenic combat sports, which led to my academic publications ultimately refuting much of what was perpetuated in modern literature on the topic. But this subject is very different to Pankration. Here, instead of prior knowledge of combat sports, modern scientific tools and chemical analyses of archaeological findings could provide clear-cut evidence of whether doping was a part of ancient Hellenic athletics. In this video, I'll walk you through some of the studies I analyzed and show you as clearly as I can how every single author of at least 24 papers and books I went through had no substantiations for their claims. Afterwards, I'll go over one study that does have some merits until its conclusion. I will provide all sources I reference in the description, the vast majority of which I was able to find through the Internet Archive and through Sci-Hub. I'm an independent researcher, meaning I do not have an institutional login. If you'd like to support me so I can continue making equivalent content for the channel, you can do so via Patreon. It comes with a ton of exclusive content as well. Now, the first article I read was Doping in Sports in Ancient and Recent Times. At first, it speaks of the diet of Milo of Croton, stating that it was rich in beef, which is well known. But they state that the beef was consumed with the addition of stimulating substances. Again, unsubstantiated claim. I should also state here that when it comes to foods like cheese, sesame seeds, or dried figs, these were all part of the nutritional norm for Mediterranean nations, so I wouldn't consider them as a form of doping because they were first used to nourish and not strictly for athletic performance. Then the article writes, in the 3rd century BC, some Olympic athletes ate particular mushrooms and consumed special bread to which analgesic substances had been added. Also, the assumption of magical potions deriving from the vegetable and animal realm to improve physical fitness and sportive performance is documented both in ancient Greece and Rome. For pretty much everything I just read there's only one reference. That is the history of the development of anabolic androgenic steroids, which you can see here. And this one line is the only statement made on the subject in the entire article. And again, no references are listed, so the previous article and this article are ultimately null, and we've reached the dead end. And this happens again and again and again for every single study I looked through, and most of them had outrageous claims. Here's just a sample of what I was able to find. Athletes drinking herbal teas, which I suppose they visited China for. Brandy, which was invented in 14th century France. Hallucinogenic mushrooms, herbs and funguses, wine concoctions, various plants, power beverages, seeds and other substances, and much more, all pulled straight out of their imagination. This article here sources Galen as living in the 3rd century BC, which was then copied by multiple other authors who didn't bother to check when he actually lived. In fact, all of these authors seem to really like the 3rd century BC in particular, because they also claim that Philostratus and even Homer were 3rd century BC authors. Now, keep in mind that both Galen and Philostratus were Roman era scholars, an anachronism of around 500 years. But then we have Homer, who apparently documented the ingestion of mushrooms by Greek athletes in the 3rd century BCE, which is pretty amazing considering that Homer likely lived in the 8th century BCE, and of course, there are no such passages in the Iliad or the Odyssey. These studies state that Galen lived during the same time as Homer, despite being 1,000 years apart. That would be like saying Neil Armstrong lived during the same time as Emperor Basil II of the Byzantine Empire. Another funny passage is, yet even in ancient times, doping was considered unethical. In ancient Greece, for example, identified cheaters were sold into slavery. This one made me laugh out loud. Imagine eating one too many sesame seeds and getting sold into slavery. But all joking aside, this is embarrassing, and of course the source listed here mentions no such thing. But wait, here's another one. With regard to power beverages, wine enriched with activating principles predominated. But water too, drunk in great quantities, and particularly with addition of marine salt, seeds, and other substances, was considered an optimal integrator. I mean, how do you write this without a shred of shame? Just making things up and then submitting it to be published in a scientific journal. Was this peer-reviewed? Hopefully not. Now, to sum things up, here's the graph that I made showing exactly how the references of all 24 books and articles I studied reached a dead end. None of them had a primary source linking doping to pre-Roman Greece. Not one. And this leads me to the final paper I mentioned earlier as having some merit. What makes this study interesting is that it deals with an actual skeleton of a 5th century Olympic athlete discovered in Taranto in southern Italy. Through examining this skeleton, they found evidence of significant muscular hypertrophy with enhanced functionality for running, jumping, throwing, and even wrestling, which makes sense because this was likely a pentathlete, given that the tomb was found with amphorae decorated with scenes of the pentathlon. There is also evidence that the athlete used alteres, the Greek weights, as we see them in ancient pottery, and that his diet likely consisted of significant amounts of vegetables, as well as cereals, meat, and particularly small fish, shellfish, and crustaceans, which are exactly what Hippocrates and his contemporary Galen recommended for athletes to consume. This article had me jubilant to see that there is evidence that athletes did follow the regimens recommended by doctors of their time. Linking archaeological findings with what is attested in ancient texts is always incredibly exciting. That being said, the conclusions with regard to the possibility of doping for this athlete are wild. First, they state that a section of the skull had an enlarged diameter, which likely contained a big pituitary gland, stating in turn that it also likely produced a large amount of the human growth hormone. But given that in the abstract they say their hypothesis is that the athlete was doping, are they actually insinuating that a 27-year-old in the 5th century BCE was injecting himself with HGH? They don't provide any explanation as to what it is they're suggesting, which is odd to say the least. Their other assertion is that a moderately high level of arsenic found in the bones, which they say he got through eating small fish, acted as a corroborant. It concurred to improve the athlete's performances. At last, its continuing intake might have provoked its death without his knowing. A lot going on in this last paragraph. Firstly, studies more recent than the ones referenced in regards to arsenic in fish show that the inorganic arsenic exists in incredibly small quantities, to the point of being entirely harmless. If the athlete died of arsenic poisoning, the likeliest cause would be from arsenic in the drinking water. But the assertion that arsenic can act as a performance enhancer seems absolutely ludicrous, because that chemical is actually incredibly detrimental to one's health and even day-to-day function. The leap they're taking to say that the athlete died of arsenic poisoning while being an Olympic athlete at the age of around 27 is a bigger leap than what the athlete was probably capable of. There's a host of different causes that could have led to his death and would not appear in the bone structure, like being slashed or pierced in a battle of some sort. Still, the far-fetched and unfounded deductions regarding doping aside, the article is incredibly interesting in how it gives us an image in which we can see an athlete that both trained specifically for the functions of his sport and likely followed a diet similar to what was recommended by doctors of the era, like Hippocrates and Herodotus before him. This was the only saving grace of what was otherwise an entirely unfruitful dive into doping in ancient Hellenic athletics. From the research I've done, there is absolutely no evidence that psychotropics, alcoholic concoctions, or other substances outside of the nutritional norm were consumed with the intention of enhancing the performance of athletes in the Hellenistic and prior eras. Keep in mind that the ancient Greek Ilians that organized and hosted the Olympics had criteria of eligibility, as one author correctly points out. The athletes were required to live and train on site in Olympia for weeks prior to the event, supervised by the umpires. Doping may not have been a cheating offense during the time, likely because it didn't exist, but it is an offense today, and there are valid arguments for both sides on whether it should be or not. On one hand, anti-doping procedures are incredibly corrupt and can be quite ineffective. But on the other hand, openly allowing the use of PEDs could incentivize even more people, especially younger athletes, to take substances that ultimately increase their risk for harm, drugs that would otherwise have been avoided. What we really need is a cultural shift, a shift away from glorifying the winning at any cost mentality, a notion that is antithetical to the ideal of the ancient Olympics. Because, as Hippocrates states, food and exercise, while possessing an opposite quality, work together to produce health, and good health is, in and of itself, far greater than any reward or trophy.